Okay, so I am very happy to present to you Hannah Dinkle. Hannah is the new director of literary arts at the J, and she was very involved in last month's Jewish Book Festival. In fact, yesterday, during an online Merowitz Center program, Hannah introduced another author from the book festival. So we really, really appreciate her expertise and insights, as well as our partnership. So Hannah, thank you for joining us again today. And please welcome and introduce Dr. Lazaroff for us.
Thank you so much, Laura. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to be here this afternoon. Dr. Lazaroff, a St. Louis Jewish Book Festival author, is a retired St. Louis area pediatrician who published his second book, Illumination, earlier this year. His fictional account of 4 generations of Jews shines a bright light on immigration and the subsequent challenges faced by many American Jewish families, including secular assimilation and success, overt and covert antisemitism, and spiritual grounding in today's hyper-connected world. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Richard Lazaroff.
Good afternoon. Thanks you all for having me. I don't know if any of you have read the book yet or not. Hopefully you have, and if you haven't, hopefully you'll get interested and maybe want to read it. Just a little background about myself. I did practice pediatrics for nearly 40 years. When I retired, I decided I wanted to do other things with my life. I wasn't urgently needing to retire or vastly wealthy, but I just wanted to move on with my life. And one of the things I wanted to do was write. I first wrote a book on parenting. It's called Some Assembly Required. And it's nonfiction. And that was really pretty easy. All I had to do was recount things that I said every day in the office. Writing a piece of fiction was another thing altogether, historical fiction. So the impetus to write this, I vacation in South Haven, Michigan, have for the last, 10 to 12 years. And about 8 or 9 years ago, my wife and I were out for a walk and we came across a monument in a public park. It's called Packard Park. And the monument was entitled Jewish Resorts. And as you read the information, it discussed the fact that South Haven, Michigan, in the 1930s had over 60 Jewish resorts. And they discussed a group that was called the Chicago Jewish Agricultural Society, and said they played a large role in settling the area. At the time, I was reading a book called Orphan Train. Orphan Train tells about a piece of history that a lot of people didn't know about, where in 30s during the Depression in New York City, where a lot of Irish Catholics had immigrated to the United States and weren't doing well, weren't very successful, they actually gave their children to the church. The church put them on trains and sent them out to the Midwest where they were picked up. So I read that book and I said, wow, I've never heard about any of that. So now I see this monument. They're talking about 60 Jewish resorts in South Haven. Well, I'd never heard about that either. Calling it the Catskills in the Midwest. I'd heard of the Catskills, obviously, but not the Catskills in the Midwest. So I came home from that vacation, and my mother, who was born in about 1929, that might be the age of some of you who are around on the screen today. She said, well, where did you go for vacation? I said, well, we were in South Haven, Michigan. And she said, my daddy used to take me there in the 30s. So he was one of these people who took his family to South Haven. Why did they go to South Haven? The automobile had been, fairly recently invented and gas was available. Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Indianapolis were close by. If you traveled up to this area and you wanted to be in a resort, some of the resorts said no dogs, no Jews. So it was inevitable that Jewish resorts would get the large part of the business. And these were kosher resorts in the 30s. There's no resemblance of that in South Haven anymore. They don't have a very vibrant Jewish population, actually. And the resort industry is there in spades, but they're not Jewish resorts. Anyway, started to look into who the Chicago Jewish Agricultural Society was. And there was a rabbi who was very involved, but the money came from Europe. And there was a gentleman who was a German Jew. He had moved to Paris. His name was Maurice de Hirsch. The Baron de Hirsch in the 1890s was the sixth wealthiest man in the world. He'd made his money through copper and the Orient Express. And he had a vision of taking his money, he had no living heirs, and establishing a fund to help Jews immigrate from Eastern Europe and Russia. He thought they were not safe. And he really wanted to place them throughout the world, not necessarily just in the United States, although many were placed here in the United States. The Baron de Hirsch Fund assisted people to emigrate and subsequently immigrate to specific countries around the world. That fund exists to the current day. One of the reasons it exists to the current day is Baron de Hirsch did not believe in handouts. He expected people to pay back loans, which most were able to do. He was approached at the time by the Zionists in Europe who wanted really Israel to be the place, Theodor Herzl. They actually met, the two men met. He wanted money to help Jews in Russia at the time. And the Baron de Hirsch really wanted to have his hands on more of this. He didn't like Herzl's ideas. It wasn't he was against the formation of Israel, but he believed in just spreading Jews out around the world. So anyway, all this was background information. I came home and said, I'm gonna write a book about this. And a couple of years went by. And then the COVID pandemic occurred. And with COVID, I found myself with time, as many of you have been, and I thought it was time to try. And I say to try because writing a novel, a fiction, is difficult. So this is historical fiction. There's two stories in the book. There's a modern day story. Every other chapter takes place in the modern day, where a young woman who is confused about the role religion should play in her life. She happens to be Jewish, but it could be any faith, because in our society these days, faith is certainly something that's undervalued, I would say. And she's in an interfaith marriage, wondering what she's missing out by not being more religious. Her husband's religious; he's a devout Catholic. Interfaith marriage. The other side of the story, every other chapter, goes back all the way to 1892, and we follow a family that immigrates from Kiev, Russia, to Michigan, and ultimately settles in the South Haven area. So the whole story takes place in South Haven. I joke it takes place in a 10 or 15-mile radius in South Haven. The people in the book are all fictional. I shouldn't say that exactly. When we go back to the nonfiction aspect of this book, most of the history that I wrote in the book is accurate. That's real. Not the family that participates in it. So my main character, Rachel, you see her mother, you see her grandmother, you see her great-grandmother, who's the original immigrant. And primarily I focus on the women. It's sort of a woman's book. It's written through a woman's voice, a woman's point of view, even though I'm a male. And that was an interesting part of writing a book too. So writing in a woman's voice, going back and forth in time, apparently were challenges, which I was unaware of, being a novice to literature, but those were big challenges, but I think ultimately I carried it out. So the opposite side goes through from 1892 to the present. I stopped along the way wherever I wanted to. That's one of the great things about writing. You're the author, you have author's license. You can do whatever you want. And so if I wanted to talk about World War II and the Holocaust, which how could you not speak about these years without that? I did that. If I wanted to talk about the polio vaccine in the 1950s, invented by Jonas Salk, who was a Jew, has some connections to St. Louis. Some of his grandchildren live here. And I talked about polio and the polio virus chapter, for example. Some of you who are older probably realize that there was a big mess when the vaccine went to production. The NIH heard studies and approved this vaccine after 3 hours of deliberation. These days it would take 3 years nearly, although COVID vaccine we got out pretty quickly, but it wasn't a 3-hour conversation with COVID. But they had it produced by a company in California that didn't do the work properly and ended up giving children polio, a large number. And it's led to some of the vaccine hesitancy. So by going back in time, I was able to talk about things that are appropriate now with vaccine hesitancy, for example. I talked about the 1933 World's Fair in Chicago. I had no idea that had occurred. I had no idea that on July 3rd, 1933, they filled Soldiers Field, where the Chicago Bears play, to see a theatrical production called A Romance of a People. and it told the 3,000-year history of the Jewish people. Big Torah was rolled out to the 50-yard line, and kind of an incredible event. Rachel's grandmother and great-grandmother go to that event. Her grandmother becomes a Zionist from that event because the event was put on by the Zionists. That World's Fair was developed as having people from Chicago of different walks of life be appreciated. So the Polish people wanted a day, the Czechs wanted a day, and the Germans wanted a day. Well, the Jews wanted a day. Well, they weren't a state. There was no Israel. They were religion. So they discussed it back and forth. Eventually, they decided to let the Zionists do it, and the Zionists put on this performance. When Rachel's grandmother attends this performance, she comes home a week later, and on the cover of Time magazine is Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda expert. And on the cover of Time magazine, 1933, Goebbels is quoted as saying, "Remember, all of you, go to bed every night and remember that the Jews are the problem." Now, our country denied what was happening in Europe till the camps were discovered, many years later. We didn't want to get into the war. That's fair in some ways. And then again, genocide is genocide. So the backstory just hits on different points in time, and I try to tell different stories. Rachel herself has to appear in the backstory. When we first meet her, it's about 2016, and she's a 40-ish-year-old pediatrician. She's not me, she's a woman, but she's a little bit of me. And she is an interfaith marriage, and she's busy. The opening chapter talks about her rushing about. She's just too busy to stop and think about things, but she lights the Sabbath candles every Friday night, and she just reflects on her life. She doesn't light them with her children, lights them by herself. If her children are there, they participate, but often she just lights them by herself. And later on in the book, she meets with a rabbi, and I talk about how the rabbi speaks of Abraham Heschel, who was probably the foremost theologian in American history. And he tells her, the rabbi tells her, that Heschel said that when you light the candles on Friday night, you're taking care of the only valuable commodity any of us have, and that's time. And you stop time, and you can savor it and hold it. I met Abraham Heschel about a month before he died. So, one of my professors at Brown was a student of Heschel. So I got to meet him. Very interesting man. So Rachel's there at the very beginning of the book. You meet her, she's lighting the candles, she's reflecting on her life, she's feeling empty. Her husband's a devout Catholic. She can't figure that out exactly because she wasn't raised in a devout sort of environment. She was raised in the assimilated area of the 1950s and 60s. Assimilation was prominent. Her parents had a Christmas tree, even though they were both Jewish. So she was confused as to the role religion should play. Her husband, he was devout. She couldn't understand if he was devout because he really bought it all, or was he simply raised in a different environment. In the book, I say he was raised maybe in a place where Catholicism ran undefeated and unopposed. So this is the marriage she's in, and she's trying to make sense of life. She is out walking one day and happens to come across the rabbi who performed an interfaith marriage for her. And she says, "I've had things on my mind about my faith, and can I meet with you and can I talk to you?" And in those chapters where she meets with the rabbi, we get to some of the themes of the book, the really more serious themes of the book, and I'll discuss those in a minute. Some people want to know what it's like to write a book. I was speaking earlier with our moderators, and I'd come in my study where I'm sitting right now, and I'd look at a blank screen and had no idea what I was going to write about, except I knew that maybe it was a chapter where Rachel was going to be 16 years old. And I decided I wanted to bring her into the backstory, and thinking, well, what am I going to do with her? She's 16. So I have her take a driver's test, which she fails, even though she's the smartest kid anybody's ever seen, but she didn't read the stupid book. And she comes home and throws herself in the bed. She's angry with herself. And she says, why couldn't I read this little book and learn about driving? But at the same time, she sees a little book on the nightstand, and it's Elie Wiesels' Night. And she she wonders what it's about. She hasn't read it yet, but it's been assigned to her in English class at school, and coincidentally assigned to her to read in religious school, same time. And so she reads it in one sitting because it's only 90 pages. And if some of you have read it, you probably remember the flames. You know, he's all consumed about the flames that he saw in Auschwitz, and he sees his father perish. And Elie Wiesels lost his faith and never regained it, even though he's certainly famous for his writing and a very famous survivor of the Jewish Holocaust. But I'm not sure he ever died with faith in God. She comes down and asks her mother about the book. She said, "Did you read this in school?" And lo and behold, this all coincidence. The book had come out about when her mother was 16, and so her mother read it at 16. And her mother said, "My parents had a big argument. My mother wanted us to read it. She thought it was great. My dad wasn't sure the other students in the class would be sensitive enough to the issues." And she said, "But I'm talking out of school. Call your grandmother and ask her." And they have a conversation about faith. She asked her grandmother about faith in God, and because her grandmother lived during the period of the Holocaust. She lost children in the war. And it's an interesting conversation. But that all took place on a blank screen one day when I really had no concept of what I was going to write about. I didn't know I was going to write about Elie Wiesels. I didn't know what I was going to write about, but it just happened. So the creative process of writing a book is really a lot of fun. I had help. I had a couple of people who read the book as sort of beta testers, if you will. So as these were friends of mine, I played competitive bridge. A couple of them were people around my bridge center, and I would just put out, serial chapters. They kept me going. They pushed me to keep writing, keep finishing. They said, "I want another chapter." So some of those people read it. Eventually, I had some professional help with some book coaches and even an editor in London who was very, very helpful. So it's a big process to write a book. And when you're finished, it's a big accomplishment. I'm not going to say it's like a woman who carries a baby and births the baby, but it probably isn't too different. You're very proud in the end of what you've toiled with for 9 months and to produce. And as to how long it took me to write the book, probably a year and a half, start to finish maybe. So what's going on in our country right now that's relevant for this book? The number of Jews in the world used to be the primary place was the United States. We have the majority of Jews in the world. We don't anymore. Assimilation, loss of faith. It isn't that so much Israel has grown, but Israel now has the most Jewish people. Now, that doesn't mean they're religious people, doesn't mean they are here either, but they have the most Jewish people, so things are changing. Anti-Semitism in the news, unfortunately, way too much lately. On Sunday, this past Sunday, on the CBS Sunday Morning News Show, a rabbi in LA spoke about anti-Semitism. 10 years ago, he said he gave his sermons about anti-Semitism and said we shouldn't be using that word. We're not that the word was wrong. He said, but we're safe here in America. Things are good. We can't play the victim card in our country. And he now is reflecting 10 years later, and he didn't feel that was necessarily the case. He didn't feel like we're on the road to Auschwitz, but he thought we were on the road to the wrong place, and that people are fearful and have a right to be fearful. I sent a copy of that interview to a rabbi who helped me with the book, and he said the same thing. He gave the same speeches 10 years ago about victimization and how it's inappropriate. So Jewish people are not raising their children as Jewish. Some are, obviously. The Orthodox certainly are. The Orthodox, I was not raised Orthodox. I was raised in the Reformed tradition. The Orthodox are almost a sect. I mean, they're really pretty different. And many Jews feel almost as far removed from an Orthodox Jew as they maybe do from a Christian. But they are Jewish for sure. The Orthodox Jews also reproduce, and they're very much encouraged to reproduce, not have a lot of birth control. So I was in interfaith marriage, and just like Rachel in the book, there's decisions to make. What are you going to do with the kids? At the time, I was caring for a rabbi, female rabbi here in St. Louis, and she had a new baby. And she was running interfaith marriage classes, and she encouraged me to make a choice. It was fine to expose them to traditional holidays. My kids lit the menorah, and we celebrated Passover, and they read the Haggadah, and participated. But they weren't raised as Jewish. They were raised as Catholic because my wife was a practicing Catholic. She goes to church almost every day. So that was the choice we made. Kids, as a pediatrician, I believe, and as a parent, I believe kids need an anchor. We talk about swimming a lot as a pediatrician. I think if you don't teach your kids to swim, you're not a bad parent, but you're making a mistake. They need to know how to swim. They could die. They could drown. I don't want them to swim for good exercise. It's great if they want to. Maybe they'll become a great swimmer, Olympic swimmer. But they all need to be taught to swim. And if you're a parent and you don't attend the swimming lessons, you've missed the boat, so to speak. So I think you miss the boat when you don't give children a chance to see a religion. And I think they need faith as an anchor. For me, making that choice, though, gave me a very separate feeling from my children and my own family. And Rachel experiences that in the book. She goes a couple times a year. She just feels, here we are. One of the most important things about your children is faith. And yet she isn't even of the same faith. She feels very separate. And that's confusing to her. And so this is the life she lives, and she runs across the rabbis I mentioned, and starts to meet with them. And she talks about some of the issues bothering them. We already touched on anti-Semitism. An interesting conversation. I was burying my mother as I was writing this book, and the rabbi and I spoke a little bit about the fact that I was writing a book, and we were talking about anti-Semitism. And I read today in the news and papers, and you'd see anti-Semitism, ANTI-SEM, anti-Semitism, right? Semitic languages were part of other than Jewish people. There were Arabs, there were people of Turkish beliefs. There were a number of different people of Semitic languages. So to be anti-Semitic, you're against anyone who produces those languages. But when you put the whole word together as a single word, which is the way I think it ought to be written, that's very specific. That's a hatred of Jews. 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. From 70 AD till 1948, Jews lived in diaspora. They had no place to practice. They were successful people. One of the reasons they were successful was study. Study was a value that persists to the current day. Why were they to study as Jews? They were to study at home. They were to study the scriptures. They didn't have a place to go practice their faith. So to study the faith was important. And some Jewish families who were farmers maybe in the way back preferred to have their kids go to school than to work out in the farm. And they and others made different choices. But study was a big deal and was a ticket to ultimate success. Anyway, anti-Semitism is very specific. Jews in our country live in a minority. Other minorities are being singled out as well. It is not just about Jews right now. But if you live in a minority and you're a successful minority, when people struggle, they call you out. It can be as grand a scheme as Goebbels telling the people in 1933 that post-World War I, the struggles of Germany could be blamed on the Jews. That's what he said, and that's what Hitler picked up on and ran with. But it can be other things as well, more simple, like we're seeing currently in our country with anti-Semitic language by rappers and just people in the news. So anti-Semitism is a big deal and is a big part of the theme of the book. And again, I like learning that the word is different. Politics aside, it's only been since 2016, and everybody knows what I'm talking about when I say politics aside, but since 2016, hate speech has become normalized. And when leaders demonstrate that by making fun of reporters who have neurologic conditions or, using the wrong language about a number of things, other people think they can do it too. They can put hate speech out there that it doesn't hurt anybody. So So we have a big deal with hate speech. Rachel has a situation, my main character, Rachel Walsh, where she is in her office one day. She sees a little boy with a broken arm, and she makes a diagnosis and takes an x-ray, and the boy comes back to the office. I named the boy Billy Martin. That's just my own fun. You know, he was a second baseman for the Yankees and a famous manager who got into it. So again, when you're the author, you get to do whatever the hell you want. So maybe someone knows who Billy Martin is, somebody doesn't, which is fine with me. Anyway, he breaks his arm and he gets diagnosis, and he comes back in, and Billy Martin and his father there, and Rachel says, you know, he needs an orthopedic surgeon. He doesn't need surgery, but he needs to have his arm casted. And the man says, well, I don't care who you send me to, but not to a Jewish doctor, not knowing that he was speaking to Rachel Walsh, who was Jewish. Her last name's Walsh. She probably never thought she was Jewish with a last name like that. That actually happened to me, though, in practice. So they have a conversation. Anti-Semitism is sometimes something we experience peripherally. So if Kanye West is mouthing off, all of us feel something inside. If you're at the grocery store and the wrong thing is said, you may feel something inside. If you go to look at Talking Today at the Bridge Center, if you go watch Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the movie Yellow Submarine, they have a scene where the guy says, "Are you bluish? You don't look bluish." It's depends who's saying the joke. The other night on Saturday Night Live, forget the guy's name, he's so controversial, but he put his toe in it about Jewish people. So anyway, hate speech is on the rise. Jews have a stereotype of money lending and control over people's lives. I don't think that's true, but that's some of the history. And again, some of the history of why they got involved in money lending had to do with the smarts that they did have. And this came from study. Another theme in the book is about being Jewish or being Jewish. Jewish with a capital J-E-W, small I-S-H, or J-E-W, capital I-S-H. Assimilation has led to many people just being socially Jewish. They may light the candles and they buy Hanukkah gifts. They might buy Christmas gifts too. They're socially Jewish. They're culturally Jewish. They may give money to Israel and think that that makes them a good Jew. All right, the Jewish people, capital J-E-W-I-S-H, they're living the faith. What does that mean? They're trying to repair the world. They're trying to live in the here and now to make this a better place. That's what we're supposed to do. My wife's always amazed. My wife's very involved in charity through the Catholic missions here in St. Louis, but she's always amazed at the charity that takes place among the Jewish faith and the Jewish people in the community. It's pretty good. Tikkun olam is the term for repair the world. So Rachel struggles with that. She's practicing in an office. She's helping people who have insurance. She's dealing with people who have food. No food scarcity. She's wondering professionally, is she doing the right thing? She's making money, she's helping people every day, but is she really repairing the world? And so that's an interesting aspect and one of the themes of the book. Reform Judaism came about in the 50s. I think most people think of Reform, conservative, Orthodox as sort of Jewish, serious Jewish people and Jewish light, like Reform Judaism, Jewish light. Reform Judaism was about Jews learning to live in the world, into the United States, and be socially conscious, to be concerned about equity and equality. I have a chapter in the book where Rachel's grandmother comes to St. Louis, of all places, and she's coming to listen to a couple of speakers, or two rabbis, and they're going to speak about 1960s and civil rights. She's getting involved in the civil rights movement. One of the rabbis is Rabbi Dreschler. He's a real character. He was the most arrested rabbi in the history of the United States. He died in the last 12 months or so. The other rabbi is Rabbi Groman. He was my rabbi at United Hebrew Temple. So these are real people as they appear in the book. Now, Rabbi Groman goes to give a talk, his little speech about equity and equality, and And he talks about his Haftorah portion that he did when he was bar mitzvah. And it's a Haftorah about the Jubilee year. So every 7 years, people were told to share the wealth of their land, but every 50 years, they were to give their land up. It was a redistribution of wealth and equity, if you will, on steroids. It happened to be my Haftorah. It wasn't Rabbi Groman's, but yeah, I was able to take, I found a piece of something lying around the office, and I realized it was my Haftorah, and I said, I can use this. So, writers are always on their toes about what to do, but Jewish versus Jewish, assimilation. Women, you see in the book that women show up at these resorts in the 50s, all of a sudden they look different. They've had a nose job. So these are some of the features of this book as well. Israel, it's a big theme in the book. To me, Israel's confusing. I don't know to most of you how confusing it is or it isn't. I've been there recently, my only visit. It was a short visit, but a good visit. Whether or not you believe in a two-state solution, on campuses right now, people are anti-Israel because they're not fair to the Palestinians. They think that we're not being fair. Some Jews feel that that's true. That's pretty confusing. The rabbi tells Rachel that he's glad that Israel's there because it might be the only safe place in the world for him to go. He feels like it's a security blanket because, you just never know. He talks about authoritarian governments, how they can pop up out of anywhere. Obviously, that's what happened with Hitler. It's a bit extreme to say that we're losing our democracy here in the country. Then again, that's what we're hearing. So we're frightened of authoritarian governments and what could happen. I talk a little bit about the book about observing Jewish law. I think that's something people don't understand in terms of the history of the Jews. I mentioned earlier about diaspora and how you had to study. So many Jews who are more Orthodox are studied. But U.S. Jews are gradually feeling more separate from Israel and always being on the same page with what's happening in Israel. If it's in conflict with the United States, is different. And as to what's going to happen with Israel and the focus on Israel, if oil were not so important, I can't say. I think our country is very interested in this region because of oil. Having a war in Ukraine right now. Is our country, why are we interested? Most of the people I listen to on television say we're interested because of our self-interest. It's always what it is. What is it that we want? We want Russia to fail. We want that other government. I'm not sure we want it because of human rights abuses or war crimes or, we just want it, I think, to keep our economic status. We are living here in post-World War II America. The United States has been the winner. We restructured the world order. We're being challenged now by China, but we want to keep it the way it is. Why is Rachel thinking about her faith in Judaism? I mentioned already, she's wondering if she should be doing more for social justice. Busy in her office, she's not really helping enough people. She's worried about death. Many Jews that I would speak to thought the Jews did not believe in afterlife. It's a very common misconception that Jews don't believe in afterlife. I think part of the reason for that is that the Christian world certainly believes in heaven and hell. They believe you're supposed to be living here and being a good doobie so you can go to heaven, because that's where it's really at. That's where the party will be, everything will be great. We're supposed to live here in the here and now, make this a better place to live. Going to heaven is not an afterthought, but it's not the goal, if you will. There are significant writings in the Jewish faith that describe heaven. There is no hell, but there's a heaven. Some of the writings talk about that we'll all be there together when the Messiah comes, as if Jesus were not the Messiah. Some people talk about the soul living on, and other people talk about we live on through the people we live behind. But there's certainly concepts of the afterlife in in Jewish faith, but she's worried about that. She wants to feel something about where it goes in the end. She's very interested in. She becomes more interested in the Judaic history of her area. She starts to realize her parents and family were a big part of this movement, and she starts to look at the Talmud and look at the Torah and try to understand even the Zohar a bit, which is the book of mysticism. Tries to understand what these things have to offer her, and she starts to work with the rabbi on these things. The Zohar and the whole concept of mysticism, which may be new to some of you and maybe not to others. I tried to write a little bit about mysticism. So, again, a lot of research for this book. Fortunately, the girl who grew up next door to me is a Kabbalist in Israel. So we had some phone calls and we talked about the theories of Kabbalah origin. And it was very interesting to feel that way. I did similar research with my neighbor on the other side of my house, whose wife died in her 40s of ovarian cancer, because the main character, Rachel, loses her husband in the course of this book to an illness and struggles with grief. Death in the afterlife. So there's a quote in this book. I'm going to read it. I just love this. So as I wrote the book, at the end, I was really pretty much finished. And I wanted a rabbi to look at it, make sure it was accurate. The Jewish stuff in there. I wanted to be sure it was accurate. So I called a rabbi locally who would help me bury my mother, but he was sick at the time. He had said he might do this, and he was sick, so he couldn't do it. So I'm trying to think of who I can call. And I thought about calling this lady. I took care of her kid, as a baby. And anyway, then I realized I went to Sunday school with the kid who became a rabbi. I don't know where the hell he was, but I found him. I just typed his name into the computer, Gary Huber, and his quote is on the back of the book, one of his quotes about what the book is about. Anyway, Gary reviewed the manuscript for me, and he made, I think, a single correction, and then he added the quote that's on the back of the book. But another thing we did is just as Rachel visits the rabbi, he and I started visiting on the phone, and we hadn't talked to each other in 50 years, but we talked. Anyway, one of the things he shared with me was his mentor. His name was Jack Reimer, Rabbi Reimer. We have Rachel grieving, and the rabbi says this to her, but it's actually a quote of Rabbi Reimer's, and it says, "God and the world to come are not two ideas. They're parts of the same idea. They're two facets of the same diamond, two sparks of the same fire, and the same hope that brings the only enduring light to the dark night of our souls." Love that. What is all this out there, and how do you put it in perspective? The new telescope that we've sent up there, sending these pictures, what is all that? I don't know how many of you have seen these pictures. They're stunning. They defy description. And to not think that there's something greater going on is hard, but to accept faith, and this is one of the themes of the book, to accept faith in God is a choice. It's a choice, and everybody has that choice to make. When I'm asked to sign this book for people, which I do from time to time, I write on the front, faith is a choice. The big statement that the rabbi makes to her, faith is a choice, and then I write Tikkun Olam, repair the world. That's my message from the book. So anyway, so death in the afterlife, there is an afterlife. There's things I learned as I wrote the book. Kol Nidra, on Yom Kippur. I remember we called it the Kol Nidra service. I used to go to Kol Nidra. That to me was the whole service. That's not what the Kol Nidra is. The Kol Nidra is the very beginning. And as a kid, I remember they turned out the lights and it went dark. And 3, 4, 5 men stood up in unison and started barking out the same thing over and over. They repeated 3 times. And that is the Kol Nidra. The Kol Nidra is an oath. It's like a legal oath. And the reason it existed was the Jews in diaspora. I mentioned that many of them would study instead of working in the fields, but others chose to work in the fields. Some were forced to give up their religion. They were at least forced to say they were going to not be Jews. and they would come on Yom Kippur to the temple and ask for God forgiveness, that they did believe in God, that the rest was BS, if you will. And that is the Kol Nidra. It's an oath of office. I am sorry, that shouldn't happen. But I have a call in for my doctor, but I'll get back to him. Anyway, so there's things about the Kol Nidra that there's a lot of things that I've had Jewish friends read that are new to them. And the last thing I would say is the book ends in Jerusalem. If you haven't been to Jerusalem, some of you I know are older. If you've never been to Jerusalem, try to go. It's amazing. I tried to capture the spirit of what I saw the day I was there in the last chapter, where she goes to the Western Wall and puts a little prayer in a crevice and between the stones. There's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of wads of paper in the stones. And makes a pledge to God to accept her faith. So anyway, I've spoken a lot. Would people like to ask me any questions about how to write a book, or what I wrote, or why I wrote it, or anything that I've mentioned about Judaism? I'll tell you one other little story, and I see a hand raised. One of the stories like that I didn't know about is, why do we light 2 candles on the Sabbath? And I didn't know. I didn't understand that. And God, I write in a book that it's like he was two-faced. He talked about remembering the Sabbath and keeping it holy. And he writes that in Exodus, that we should remember the Sabbath. But in Deuteronomy, he says, keep and safeguard the Sabbath. And so, we light 2 candles because, God was confused. He did it twice in the 5 books of Moses. So that's why, and it's Zachor and Shemor are the two candles, and they mean different things, and they've been used to mean different things. Zachor is more of a positive thing, like thou shalt honor your mother and father. Whereas Shemor is more of the negative, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. Strangely, there's 613 of these mitzvahs in the Torah. 248 are positive commandments. 365 are negative commandments. Even God, had a bad attitude, negative attitude. Anyway, I'm just teasing. You had a question. I saw one of the ladies had a hand up. Maybe you guys know what it is. Have they submitted any questions to you? I see
No,
some.
I see.
Question. You can unmute
Fran.
and ask me if you'd like.
Yeah, Fran, did you have a question? You need to unmute, Fran.
I can unmute her. I don't think I can.
Laura, is it possible for you to unmute? I'm not a host.
Yeah.
Am I unmuted now?
Okay, yes,
Yeah.
you are.
There we are.
I wanted to tell you that I've been going to South Haven for over 70 years.
All right.
My father bought a house in 1944, a block north of Packard Park on North Shore Drive.
Right.
And
You still own it. I want to buy it from you.
well, we don't want to sell it. We still own it. Anyway, I know all about the reasons, because they started going there because my girl came over from Poland in 1939, said St. Louis was too hot in the summer. She wanted to go back to Poland. Well, there was no way she was going to go back. So my dad asked around, where do you go to get cool? And so they went first to Yashinovsky's, which was one of the resorts.
Mhm.
I can tell you all about all the resorts. But anyway, the other thing I want to tell you about, I don't know if you know, that they have a synagogue that's been there in South Haven.
No, it's there. It's not very active, but it is there.
Oh, it is active now.
Well,
They have
yeah.
Friday night services, reform.
No, I know they do.
During the summer, they have Orthodox services on Shabbat. And during the year, they have conservative activities in affiliation with the Kalamazoo Synagogue. And
Right.
the rabbi from Kalamazoo
Comes down. Yeah, he comes down. So that's when I say it's not active, they don't have their own rabbi. Even on the book, I pretend they do. They don't have their own rabbi. And so they're not 24/7 in the community, but you're right. They exist in the community, and I've been to the synagogue as well.
Right. Anyway, So the reason I got your book was because it told about South Haven, and that
Mhm.
interested me.
Well,
And we
good.
go every summer, so we love it very much.
Did you read the book already?
I've read part of it.
Part of it.
Just-
Okay, good. No, I'm glad you're looking at it. And and you probably, my mother was there, and these Jewish resorts were very Jewish, right? All the food was kosher food. And
Not all of them. There was one called Barron's and the Michigan Beach Hotel that were not kosher.
okay.
And there's the whole story. Also, there's another monument, I don't know if you know about, to Pauline Cone that's
I don't think I
downtown.
saw that. No.
Oh, it's right in front of the Blueberry store
Okay.
on the main crosswalk.
And who was she?
Well, her family had a bakery there,
Okay.
and she was one of the founders of the synagogue.
Okay.
And she was very active in the government and not in the government, but in
Right.
politics. In
Community politics, anyway. Thank you.
Anyway,
Thank you
so
for
they have
sharing
a
all of
monument.
that. That's great. That's great stuff. Thank you for sharing that.
So anyway, sometimes if you want to, I'd be glad to talk to you about South Haven sometime in the future. So
And they'll maybe give me your name and phone number if they have it, and then we can relate that. Where do you live
Yeah,
over at the Covenant House? Do you live at
Myra, you
Covenant?
have it?
Do you live at Covenant House?
I'm sorry, but I
Do
didn't
you
hear
live
what
at the Covenant House? Is that where you live?
No, I live in Olivet.
But I
Olivet.
can send you the information.
Yeah, send me her contact information and we'll do
Okay.
that. Great.
I'll do
Okay.
that.
Anybody else have a question?
Myra, I see you with your hand up.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, great.
I just wanted to thank you very much for your presentation. I found it extremely interesting. And I do want to read your book.
Good.
I'm very impressed with your intellect, your way of looking at things, your depth of feeling. And I thank you very much for writing this book. I think it's good. I hope it's very, very successful. Not a people
I
reader.
wish it were. I don't know that it will be or won't be. It's very hard to be an independent author, a pediatrician in a city of St. Louis and get to a national audience, although I'm trying, and I've entered the book in some contests and national submissions for Jewish Book Awards. I think right now with anti-Semitism, it's all the more important. I mean, I think our religion is under fire in our country.
Definitely. Hadassah always has a list of books. So have you contacted them to put your book into their books to read?
You're talking about Shahir Hadash, is that who you mean?
The Hadassah organization, there's a magazine they put out every month. And
Okay, yeah, no, I have talked to them. I know who you mean now. I'm going to write it down again, though, because I don't think they followed up with me.
Yeah, I
And
would
for
be
the-
persistent.
And for the lady from South Haven, I spoke to the temple there, and we talked about, we tried to get something this summer, but we talked about planning something with the city of South Haven next summer. So
Good,
I'll
we'll
be
be
up there
there.
next summer, and I hope we get to do something.
Please call me.
Well, thank you so much for your comments about my book. I appreciate that. As I say, it's like a baby. I mean, you're so close to it. I am very proud of it. And
Also, Rabbi Reamer, Jack Reamer,
yeah,
was here for a year at Banamona. I don't know if you know it. We used to go.
I didn't know that.
No, he
Well,
was.
actually, no, I did know that because that's where Gary was briefly. That's where he knew Gary Huber.
Rabbi
Gary Huber was an Olivet kid growing up, and he lived off of Grazier Road. And I would go to Sunday school with him, and he went to do high school. He graduated certainly in the top 10 of the class. He was a smart, great guy.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting.
So,
One of my experiences I recount in the book was Gary and I were in Sunday school together, and I'll tell this story. So I was traumatized by the Holocaust. I think I was about 10 or 11. I was taken downstairs in the basement of the United Hebrew Temple, and they showed us these black and white grainy films that many of you have seen since, these Holocaust films of conveyor belts with bones going down. And I don't know what they told us. I don't know that they helped us process it, the teachers, the rabbi. I don't know that my parents did or didn't. My parents were assimilated. I don't even know if they knew I saw these things. But I was traumatized. It was like a post-traumatic stress thing. And you know, the idea that you'd want to be a Jew and end up with bones down a conveyor belt. Now, Gary went home, and I talked about this experience. He went home, and his father was involved in the war. My dad was not. His father was involved in liberating a couple of the camps. And his father gave him a very different feeling about this issue when he went home and talked to him about what he saw. And so, you know, it's an interesting aspect, all this. Not everybody got the same experience, but, and I don't mean when I write this to think that every Jew of my generation or my age is wondering about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism and the role of Israel and the afterlife, and, you know, but that's what's on my mind. And I think it is on the mind of many, and interfaith marriage and how to raise children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the message of Judaism, the history of Judaism, a beautiful message. But my book ultimately is, again, a major message in the book is faith is a choice. And that's true for all religions. And I'd be the last person to denigrate anybody who had religious faith in whatever it was, as long as it's a faith that doesn't attack and go after people of other faiths. I want to respect people of every faith. So
Okay, thank you for your talk.
thank you. Thanks for listening. Anybody else have a question?
I want to thank you. I did read your book.
Oh, good.
And my grandson is a resident. He's going to be a pediatrician. So I
Oh,
was
good.
attracted. And he's also Catholic. So there were many things that drew me to your book, especially the title. And I wondered if you could just tell us about it, because light
Sure.
means so much, especially now it's
Right.
appropriate with Hanukkah and
Right. So, you know, getting to choose a title, I mentioned I had a parenting book, and you should make sure he gets that as a pediatrician. It's called Some Assembly Required. That book, you know, where does that title come from? Some Assembly Required. I write at the end of the book, my wife and I would celebrate Hanukkah, Christmas, and on Christmas Eve, we'd be putting together some train or something. And those are the three most dreaded words in the English language, some assembly required. I hated that. So that's why that was the title. So why is Illumination the title? So Rachel's great-grandmother in early 1890s is in Kiev, and her father has decided that the pogroms are too much. He's leaving. He has a friend whose family has moved to Bad Axe, Michigan, which was really a real BADAXE, was really a real community. It failed. The weather was severe and it failed. It was a community sponsored by the Baron de Hirsch, a Jewish community. Anyway, he says, we're going, and pack lightly, you know. And she goes to her room, and she didn't have much anyway to put in a little bag. They were not people of money. And she goes to her parents and asks, is there something I can take that remind me of home? And she takes the candlesticks. I get emotional. So she takes candlesticks, and these get passed on. And the book starts with Rachel lighting the candles. It's her great-grandmother's candles. So she's in temple later in the book with her sister and her parents. She hasn't been to temple a long time, but she's been meeting with the rabbi. And they do the opening prayer and they light the candles. And it was like the whole world was illuminating for her. You know, you said light means many things. So interestingly, I searched for a picture for the front cover, a design for the front cover. And I found an Israeli artist who had the most magnificent piece of art of two candles and these colors bursting from the candles. And I wanted that. I didn't care what it cost me to put it on the cover. And anyway, I call her in Israel and I speak to her, and she said she had to read the book first. And she was a Zionist with a capital Z. And my book had too much doubt in it for her. And so she didn't give me permission. So ultimately, I chose the candles that you see. When you do a cover, you have to use stock images from Getty or your own. The cover I did for Some Assembly Required was actually my own sort of design of a cover. But this one, I used a stock image from Getty, and there were candles, and there was other crap in the background. I don't remember what it all is, but we just blackened it all out. And so all you see is the candlesticks on the front. So, they're passed down. the religion is being passed down. You know, again, I tend to think of the women in this book as the strength of the book and as a woman's book. And so that's what they are. And you're right, the light. And when we talk about the Kabbalah and the origin of the world in the book, and we refer to what, you know, some might call the Big Bang. I mean, the Kabbalah has the Big Bang theory in it. It was written ages ago, but they describe essentially what people think of the Big Bang. And we talk about the light that God sent into himself. And so, you know, the light appears a lot in the book. So that's why it's the title. Titling a book is fun. You know, it's fun. Generally, in the publishing business, you don't get to pick your title. You know, the other people pick it, the people mess with it. So anyway, Illumination, though, it's what I wanted the title to be. I'm thrilled with it. And I'm thrilled with the cover design. And I'm thrilled with the way it all appears.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else have a question? Thanks for your comments. I really appreciate the praise. You know, as a author sitting up here in this room in my house, you know, my wife will not read anything I write. So I say that to you. I mean, you know, I'm living it, and it would drive her crazy if she looked at it. So she did say she would read my book, Illumination, when it was done. And she really meant done. And when she read it, it made her cry. So that was good.
Dr. Lazaroff, I just wanted to say thank you very much for all your
Thank
time.
you.
This was just a really wonderful discussion. And
Thank you.
Hannah, thank you for the introduction, but I can't tell you how much we appreciate your time and your fine work. It's really remarkable.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you both. And again, thank the audience for participating. And if you enjoyed the book, send it to a friend. And if you have a new grandbaby coming up, buy the other one. Some assembly required. I'm very biased about my opinions, but you know, 40 years of practice experience is in the book, and it's a good place for people to start. So thank you. Thanks for your time, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
All right,
everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.